think about it is that a park is designed as a public space, and you have for it to be this intact piece of urban nature. The public becomes the enemy. And what I think is really important is the way in which the kinds of symbolism that's kind of pulled together to cast the public as an ecological enemy, I think is important to pay attention to. One of the most interesting things about the Jardin des Eaux was there was a site, and I don't know how we're doing time, but
There's a question?
okay, sure. There was a part of the park that was that gravel canal that I showed earlier was a water circulation system where water could percolate down under gravel and then flow into a canal, which was a plant-filled canal. And it was what's called biomimicry, which is increasingly important in landscape architecture. And it made a kind of symbolic statement about the importance of maintaining natural equilibrium in environments. It was all completely planned and built by the architects. And it was a very beautiful poetic vision in some respects and a technical masterpiece. But what happened is as soon as they opened it, little kids would run over to the gravel. And as little kids do, they pick up the gravel and throw it in the canal and clog up this perfect model of natural equilibrium. So it became this kind of like symbol of the limits of this kind of imagining of nature, of nature's built environment. And so the kids, little kids, became doing their natural play and kind of cast as unnatural.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting talk to get us started. Our next presentation is by Adam Newton. Maybe I actually pronounced that wrong. And this is work that he's doing with Brady and myself in history of Detroit. And Adam, if you please join me in welcoming Adam while he gets the slides.
Thank you. Thanks to my colleagues and mentors, Brady and Jeff. Thank you for everybody that showed up, and thank you to the Humanities Center for providing the opportunity to engage in scholarship like this. So I'm happy to be here and go forward. So in conducting our project, what we really wanted to do was go back to earlier times when Detroit was also not doing so well. There's a well-known adage that oftentimes things come out to be same wine, new bottle. So in many senses, we wanted to kind of go back to the original brew of bankruptcy. The problems that the city is going through right now and the ways that they're trying to get out of it is not necessarily unique to the time period that we're living in right now. The battles and the problems of the Great Depression that faced Detroit were significant and in many ways overshadowed some of the problems that are happening today. And to just give you a little bit of a background on that, in '29, the stock market crashed. In 1925, 617 banks closed. By 1930, 1,350 banks had closed. And then by 1931, 2,293 banks had closed. And there was no federal depositors insurance at this point, so those life savings, even if it was not amounting to a great deal of money, was lost. Unemployment was at record high levels, and this was coupled with production being dropped down substantially within the city. In 1932, there were 400,000 people that were unemployed in the city of Detroit. And that coupled with the fact that they were down to producing about 25% capacity. And that is in comparison to just 2 years prior when it was an industrial powerhouse, kind of kicking out cars with no problem. There were a lot of evictions and foreclosures which is something we know about as well that's happening today, but it was very astute back then. And one of the other measures that I found rather intriguing was the suicide rate. In 1927, Detroit had about 113 people that committed suicide. In 1931, there were 568. So this combined with the lack of supports that were there for cities made it a particularly tumultuous time that might be existing. That to be said, this all really focuses on, as you probably read in the program, was our idea was to look at the role that the Depression mayor Frank Murphy had played in actually ushering Detroit out of the Depression. Murphy is pictured up there. He is one of Michigan's most famous sons. He went on to become governor, later to become a Supreme Court justice. But if anything, we should really begin to focus and continue to focus on his time here as mayor of Detroit, because he was overseeing it during a time period that was just very, very hard to politically manage. That to be said, he brought in a lot of things that we're doing now as well. We may be reimagining them now, but he had things like gardens. So we had the Detroit thrift gardens that were available to help feed the populace because they didn't even really have enough money to be buying food. You had a lot of lines for people looking for work. So that all to be said, it was a really kind of a harsh time, and Frank Murphy was the right person for the job. One story to kind of illustrate that, you may be familiar with a large hunger strike that was put on during that time period. And Frank Murphy, being kind of a masterful politician, knew that he should not necessarily give them a permit right out to have the demonstration, but should not necessarily squash the demonstration. And that worked out very favorably for him. He was able to kind of appease some of the more leftist actors that were operating at the time while not upsetting kind of the status quo and the powers that be. That to be said, the structural circumstances for cities back then was not good in terms of the way that government is set up. Federalism, as we know it then, had a very stark hierarchical structure, and there were divides between the federal government and the state. Still to this day, largely, cities are considered creatures of their respective states and don't necessarily have the power to take care of things like financial issues. Murphy, realizing this, decided that there needed to be an effective way to put pressure on government. Detroit was not the only city that was going through this. There were several other major cities that had problems along these lines. And Murphy knew that the way to do it was potentially to pressure the national government. At the time, the state governments were overly representative of rural interests, and that was not boding well for the city, and then trying to get some legislation passed to help them out of the problems that they were in. So Murphy knew that he needed to kind of coalesce a group of people who could put some pressure on the federal government. And he did that through the formation of what is known as the United States Conference of Mayors. So at the very beginning of this research project, I went to the United States Conference of Mayors website and I watched a really kind of a cool video, and it was talking all about how Mayor Murphy of Detroit brings in leaders from around the country to talk about the Depression and talk about how they can move forward. And in the video, one of the things that they did was they zoomed in on a newspaper headline from a newspaper I had never heard of. It said the Detroit Times. I said, what are those? I said, I've heard of the Free Press and the News. And I just had never heard of the Detroit Times. So I looked it up in the Wayne State University Library System and was not actually finding any luck for it on microfiche. I was able to find a lot of older editions of the Free Press and the Detroit News. So that led me on a hunt. I said, this paper exists. I really want to look at it. And I'm glad that the dean had mentioned earlier on some of the great resources for conducting research in the city of Detroit, because that's where I ended up kind of getting to go. And I had told my co-authors during the process, I felt to some degree like a kind of a political Indiana Jones. It was a very romantic process to actually begin to go through this. So that led me to the Detroit Public Library, which is in fact a very amazing resource. And one of the things that they've got there is the Burton collection, the Burton Historical Collection. So housed there are an insane amount of documents that relate to Detroit's history, and in particular, there is a lot of archival material that relates to Detroit's past mayors, going from Murphy all the way up to Coleman Young. They might even be beginning be beginning to collect stuff for Duggan. But they have just volumes and volumes and volumes of stuff there, and it was really kind of awesome to go there and begin to pull some of this stuff out. So they had all of the collected documents and letters and invitations for the Depression Mayor Frank Murphy. So you go in and you can see that this is a picture here of the Burton Center. You actually have to put all of your stuff in a little locker, and you kind of have to sign things out, and it's a pretty secure environment that way, but still very, very romantic. And what ended up coming out of it was I got to sift through quite a few of the personal documents from Mayor Murphy, and what I was doing is I was on the hunt trying to discover more things about the formation of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. So before I get to some of the interesting things that I found in there were just random kind of Western Union notes, notes from secretaries, and these were all things that had his personal signature on them. They kind of smelled like old documents. Again, it was a very, very fun process. I won't go over both of them in depth. The first one is just an apology letter from the mayor of Chicago who says, hey, I essentially didn't get your Western Union in time. Next time I'll be sure to respond a little quicker. The other one, I'm sorry it was not in better focus, is a letter from the mayor of Windsor at the time. And he has caught wind that there's going to be a large conference that's happening in Detroit. And this letter is urging Murphy to let the conference attendants know that Windsor is very close, and if they wanted to go over to see what was happening there, they were very welcome to do so. And I thought that was a great little idiosyncrasy in the process. That to be said, I did end up finding quite a few documents that came from the actual convention that was put together. So here are the actual, it's the actual literature from the conference. So the conference was held there here in Detroit, June 1st, 1932. And you can see here exactly what kind of the aim and the focus was of the conference. What they wanted to do was provide for direct and immediate federal relief. They wanted some sort of way to ameliorate the city from a lot of the problems that were happening. And we had talked about some of the deep context behind what was making the city particularly tumultuous. However, the practical side of it was that people didn't have jobs, they didn't have any savings, and nobody was able to pay their property taxes. So as a result, the city had no money. Their coffers were bled dry, but they still had obligations. They still had to conduct city services. They still had to try to pay people's pensions to some degree. They had things that they needed to do. So the city was not in a position to where they could just leave everybody on the hook. They really had two options at the time. The first option was to just keep borrowing money and keep spending. And we know that that can have bad results for a city. That's going to end up costing you a lot more money in the long term than it's going to necessarily save you in the short term. And the other option was to just straight up default. Murphy was a man of integrity and really did not want to go with that option. There's a great quote where he said that the city of Detroit is a rich city and we will always pay our debts. So he was very adamant about figuring out a way to essentially put the city of Detroit in a position to where they could have a mortuarium on the debt that was building up, so that it potentially 10 years. The other thing that was happening was that he wanted to get some loans for unemployment insurance, and that was actually one of the things he was able to successfully do under the Hoover administration. The Hoover administration and the subsequent Congress was not very favorable to the cities. They kind of thought, for the most part, that, hey, cities, you put yourself in this situation. It is not necessarily good practice to go and ask the states and other people within the community to bail you out for the way that you were living. And the conventional wisdom there was that they were just engaging in profligate spending. So if you go forward and look at just some of the headlines, the news was covering it very well. It was a very large event. Mayors plead to Congress. Many mayors of the city hall come in, and the mayor did try to start, as I had said, kind of a relief coalition that had come together. So I will pause a little bit. Again, so just more headlines. The idea was where to get welfare aid. all of the mayors of the large cities were facing these same kinds of problems, so they decided, hey, we need to figure out a way that we can not have this happen again. Now fast forward to the end and kind of fast forward to where we're at now. You've got Governor Snyder and the emergency manager Kevin Orr there standing in front of a sign that says, reinventing Detroit. And as many of you probably know, this is kind of at the announcement where the emergency manager is beginning to take over for the process. This leads us to kind of where our research took us. So while all of the collecting of the evidence and going through the process of learning about Murphy and kind of some of the different resources at the university, we found out that the paper we wanted to write has already largely been written, and there was not much that we could contribute to the literature in the way of looking at Frank Murphy's particular contribution into changing the way that the government deals with cities. So as a result, we kind of wanted to look at one particular aspect of it, which was the pensions. And that is where we are moving forward out of this research. The new research that we're looking at, the title of the paper is Bad Choices, the Impact of Political Structure on Urban Pension Problems. So we understand today, as it has been unfolding in Detroit, one of the problems are these underfunded pensions. And pensions are a problem for cities' budgets. They end up being one of the city's largest obligations, and it can get the city in quite a bit of financial problems. We are very interested in understanding the motivations behind why political officials, elected or unelected, are going to engage in behavior that could potentially be risky. Why are you necessarily going to try to maximize your short-term gains at the cost of the long-term health and future of the city? So in the future, we are working steadily on this project, and it was
Thank you, Adam. One element of the project that I want to kind of emphasize, or I think is particularly interesting, is that one of the things that Frank Murphy and the Conference of Mayors led the charge on was the creation of the first laws that allowed cities to go bankrupt. And so one of the interesting things is that in the 1930s, Detroit actually did default on its debts. It was not allowed to go bankrupt under the law at the time, and there's nothing they could do about it. And so one of the things that I find interesting about this project and the history is that he then went to Congress to lobby it to create a way for municipal governments to go bankrupt. And so like the mayor of Detroit in the 30s was instrumental in creating the law that provided the framework that allowed us to go bankrupt today. I think that's kind of an interesting piece of the story. Okay, and so are there questions for Adam and Brady and I?
So you're shifting your research to looking at the pension issues for governments. And so I'm wondering if you've looked at what business, what is the history of what pensions, what have happened with pensions in businesses and the issues that they've had in terms of the funding and the laws, the federal laws for funding and the federal support for funding these or protecting these pensions. And then the issues of companies trying to leave pensions and put this responsibility in another area back mainly on the employee.
So the paper that we're working on now isn't looking so much at the business indicators as we are looking at the role of government structures, the structure of government, and that's impact on a city's decision to go forward with one particular type of pension policy of the menu of options that are out there. So we're particularly going to be looking at the dynamic between council manager form of government and mayor council form of government and see if a political versus a non-political city would have explain any of the variation between their choice in pension programs.
Yeah. If I could make a little bit different spin on or take on the answer, one of the things that's interesting about studying like state and municipal pensions, maybe state pensions in particular, is that the federal government can't tell the states what to do. Because like kind of in the eyes of the Constitution, the federal government and the states are subordinate branches of government, And so unlike businesses, where the federal government could say, these are the rules governing your pensions, and the businesses are expected to follow those rules. The federal government doesn't have the same discretion, as I understand the law, as with respect to the states as it does to private corporations. So it's just a different dynamic. Yeah. In the back?
Hi, how you doing, Adam? Are you aware that in certain public pensions, that Social Security, especially in the state of Michigan, was taken away from police and fire, but the city employees were allowed to collect Social Security, so the pension structure here in the city of Detroit is structured a little differently for police and fire versus just general city employees? And what do you all think about that? The fact that police and fire are not going to get Social Security because of a deal that was struck back in the 60s in the state of Michigan, which is also why they had the quote constitutional clause protecting the pensioners.
So you talk about the fire and the police department.
No, yeah, so at this point, we're still kind of wrestling with like some of the, like how you measure, like how badly underfunded these pension systems are. And so like for like police and fire, state and some employees, as we understand kind of rules, have long been able to opt out of Social Security. They don't pay the taxes because they get a state pension instead. And so one of the really horrible aspects of the cuts to the pensions is that they didn't pay in Social Security, they don't get to collect Social Security, and so the public sector employees don't get the same safety net that everyone else gets. And that's one of the things that makes the use of bankruptcy so problematic. Okay. I think we'll want to save the rest of the questions for the end, so that way we can ensure that Sarah has time to give her presentation. Please join me in welcoming her.
Okay, well, I'll start while they figure out that no, I'm gonna need your help. Yeah, please, work your magic. So I'm Sarah Swider, and first I do want to thank again the Humanities Center for all the work they've done in putting together today's event, but also just generally in creating us stimulating and intellectual spaces for us at Plain State community. So let me start my talk, and the slideshow will catch up with us. But I'd like to start my talk with giving you the central argument that I'm going to put forth today, which is I'm going to argue that the main engine of Detroit's economy, both during the period of decline and during this possible period of revitalization, has been African American women. And most of their work is in it, well, not most, but much of their work actually is in the informal economy. And based on that argument, I'm going to suggest that, therefore, if we want to envision and understand the path to revitalization, we must acknowledge and understand their work and the informal economy and how it varies across industries. So hopefully in 15 minutes I'll convince you of these arguments. With or without the slideshow. Okay, so let me start with the definition of what I mean by the informal economy. The informal economy, what I mean by the informal economy is that it includes activity that is legal and paid, but conducted outside of state regulation in terms of taxes, welfare, and labor law. So what I mean is if you have a garage and you're a mechanic and you have friends and family and neighbors who are dropping off their cars and you're doing repairs and you're collecting cash, that's work in the informal economy by this definition. It's legal, you're getting compensated with cash, but you're not necessarily claiming the taxes on it and paying taxes or doing within the guise of the state regulation. So So this definition presents us with a bit of a challenge because when we think about the informal economy, we tend to associate it with poor, developing countries or nations. And when we think of the informal economy in the context of developed nations like the United States, it is often framed as illegal or unpaid activity. Illegal activity like prostitution and drug dealing, and unpaid activity like taking care of children or doing domestic work in the household. And both of those sectors are part of the informal economy. They're just not part of what I'm looking at in the informal economy. And since we frame it in that way when we think about it, since we frame it as illegal work or unpaid work, our policies tend to be quite draconian, and our approaches tend to be limited in the way that we deal with the informal economy. So policies are often directed towards punishing those who operate in the informal economy, and they work to shut it down, basically. And theoretically, also, we tend to see the informal economy as backward remnants of an earlier phase of capitalism, or as a small secondary part of the economy that needs to be regulated out of existence. So, however, beyond my voice, there are other voices that call for us to re-envision, reimagine, or rethink the informal economy. And some of these are even voices that get a lot more, that hold a lot more weight than my own voice. Let me just, so for example, in 2002, the U.S. Academy of Management, their national meeting program theme was the informal economy. And they had actually taken inspiration by others like the Swedish International Development Cooperative Agency, which argued, quote, the informal economy has a significant job in income generation potential, and that the main challenge is thus to develop innovative and supportive policies that recognize the contributions of the informal economy and its workforce. So I'm not the only person suggesting the informal economy. We need to rethink the informal economy. So why Detroit? I would suggest that when we look at other cities, that has given us very different frameworks to analyze the city, and they're often these growth models that come out of Chicago School or LA School of thought that deal with urbanism. And basically they look at how cities are growing and how to continue to make cities grow, and really applying those frameworks to Detroit, they don't fit Detroit, first of all, because we're not growing, or we haven't been growing. And second, applying this kind of framework to Detroit really leaves these spaces of marginal spaces hidden and ignored. And so that does a kind of violence to the people in those spaces. And so really, again, Detroit is a different kind of, looking at Detroit and Detroit-like cities really changes our attention and focus and makes the invisible visible. So in Detroit, for example, in 2009, the unemployment rate was 27%, and unofficial estimates placed at 44 to 50%. That's the unemployment rate. Now, it's somewhat abated, but the numbers are still pretty shocking. And really, as capital withdrew and as the formal economy shrunk, that means about half the population was forced to find other forms of survival. And we tend to immediately think that they're going to state aid or they're doing that illegal informal economy work. But I argue that there's actually a lot of that has been the legal but informal economy work that I'm talking about today. And so, in fact, there's been some estimates, and the informal numbers are difficult to get, but estimates place it at basically over 100,000 Detroiters are working in the informal economy. Now, we know the Detroit population is roughly around 700,000, disputed somewhat. And the working population is actually about 450,000. So that's almost a fourth of the city's population that are operating in the informal economy. And so it's an important segment of the economy that I would argue that's been ignored so far. And why look at African American women, and why am I suggesting that they're the central engine of Detroit's economy? Well, first of all, I have have to say that I do feel frustrated that I even have to justify this choice. If I was looking at men, white men, or men as the engine of growth, this question wouldn't even have to go up here. But beyond that, I'll deal with the constraints I'm operating in and justify it. First of all, informal work is racialized and gendered. So women and minorities, African Americans end up concentrated in the informal economy. Second, in Detroit, women are the story behind the economy, formal or informal.